Ada's life ended in pain after Pastor Emmanuel used his power to control her. She trusted him for help, but instead, he hurt her in silence. Her parents, Grace and John, didn't know what was happening. When Ada got pregnant, Pastor Emmanuel gave her a dangerous drink, which took her life. Grace later found Ada's secret notes and learned the truth about Pastor Emmanuel. Despite their anger, Grace and John were too scared to speak out because of his power. The pastor continued to harm other girls, but some people began to speak up. In part 2, Grace and John fight their fear and guilt, trying to gather secrets about the pastor to stop him. Grace stood outside the pastor's office, her heart pounding. The file she had stolen was in her hand, and it felt heavy, like it could break her at any moment. She knew that this information could end everything. Pastor Emmanuel's reign, his lies, his cruelty. She took a deep breath. It wasn't over yet. The church was empty now. The members had gone home after a long service, and this was her chance. But what if someone saw her? What if Pastor Emmanuel found out? The fear gnawed at her, but she kept her focus. The file had everything, his secrets, his lies, the names of the girls he had hurt. Grace had to act fast. She looked around one last time. Then she slowly made her way out of the pastor's office and into the dark hallway. Every step felt like it could be her last. Outside, the night air was cool, but Grace felt nothing. Her mind was racing, her thoughts spinning. "I have to get this to the right people," she whispered to herself. She took the file and hurried to her car. It felt like the world was closing in around her. The pastor had to be stopped. She couldn't let him keep doing this. At home, Grace called John. "I got it," she said, her voice shaky. "You did?" John's voice sounded tired but relieved. "I knew you could. Now, we have to be careful." Grace sat down, staring at the file in her hands. "This could be the end, John. We can't go back now." John didn't answer right away. The silence felt heavy between them. "We have to do it for Ada," he finally said, "for all the girls he's hurt." Grace nodded. She knew that John was right. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. The next day, Grace and John met Amaka. Amaka had been the one to reach out to them first. She was the one brave enough to start gathering the other victims. Together, they went through the file, piece by piece. It was like reading a nightmare, but it was the truth. Amaka's face tightened as she read through the names. "We need to show this to the world," she said. "The truth can't stay hidden anymore." Grace looked up at Amaka. "But how? He has too much power. The church trusts him. The community follows him. He can't be stopped easily." "We have to be strong," Amaka replied. "If we don't stand up now, no one else will." Grace nodded. It wasn't just for Ada anymore. It was for every girl Pastor Emmanuel had hurt, every person who had been lied to, every family that had trusted him. They spent the next few days preparing, but their fear was growing. Pastor Emmanuel wasn't just a man of the church. He was a man of power, and he would do anything to protect it. Meanwhile, the pastor grew more paranoid. His usual calm facade was slipping. He could feel the walls closing in, though he didn't know who was behind it. One evening, while Grace and John were going over their plans, Amaka burst through the door. "It's happening," she said, her voice frantic. "Someone saw me talking to the other victims. They know I've been reaching out to people. He's already looking for me." Grace froze. "He knows." "I don't know how, but he does," Amaka said, her eyes wide. "He's not going to stop until he finds out who's been leaking information." They all stared at each other. There was no more time for fear. It was now or never. "We have to do it," Grace said firmly. We have to expose him. We can't let him hurt anyone else." One evening, as Grace and John sat in their small apartment, trying to plan their next move, Amaka's phone rang. They all turned toward the sound. Grace answered, but there was nothing but silence on the other end. She called Amaka's name, but no answer came. "Maybe she's busy," John said, trying to stay calm. But his voice trembled. They both knew that something felt wrong. The hours passed, and still, there was no word from Amaka. Grace called her again, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. "Where could she be?" Grace whispered, her heart sinking. John stood up and paced around the room. "This isn't right. She would never just disappear without telling us." His hands clenched into fists. "It's him, isn't it? Pastor Emmanuel has done something to her." Grace looked at John, her eyes filled with fear. She couldn't deny it. They knew how dangerous Pastor Emmanuel was. He had power, money, and influence, and he wasn't going to let anyone expose him. The next morning, Grace and John drove around the town, asking anyone if they had seen Amaka. No one had any information. Days passed, and the tension grew. They had no answers, and no way to find Amaka. Then one morning, they got the call. It was the police. "Grace, John, you need to come down to the highway," the officer said. "We found a body." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Grace's heart raced in her chest, but she had to ask, "Is it Amaka?" There was a long pause before the officer spoke again. "Yes, I'm afraid so." Grace dropped the phone, feeling like the ground had just been pulled out from under her. John quickly picked it up and started the car. They didn't speak the whole drive. What could they say? What was left to say? When they arrived at the highway, they were led to Amaka's body. It was a silent scene. No one spoke. The police had already covered her body, but there was no mistaking it was her. The life had been taken from her, and Grace felt a deep emptiness in her chest. This wasn't just a loss of a friend. It was the death of the hope that had kept them fighting. "We have to stop him, John," Grace whispered, tears falling down her cheeks. "We can't let her death be in vain." John nodded, his face grim. He was angry. He had lost so much, but this was too much. "We will. We have to finish what she started." Pastor Emmanuel sat in his office, unaware of what was happening. His phone rang, and it wasn't the usual calls. It was one of the men he had paid to do his dirty work. "Pastor," the man's voice sounded angry. "We have a problem." Pastor Emmanuel frowned. "What do you mean?" "We did the job, but it wasn't easy. The girl didn't go down like the others. She fought back. We had more trouble than we thought. We want more money." Pastor Emmanuel stood up, angry. "I paid you what I promised. That's enough. You do what I ask." The man didn't back down. "That's not good enough. We worked harder than we expected. You owe us more." Pastor Emmanuel clenched his fists. "I don't care what you think. You've got your money." The man's voice was cold. "You have 3 days to pay us more, or we'll deal with you. Don't make us angry, Pastor." Pastor Emmanuel felt a cold sweat on his face. "Fine, I'll get the money, but don't try to come after me." "We'll see," the man said. 3 days. The line went dead. Pastor Emmanuel stood still, his mind racing. This was getting out of control. Everyone was coming for him. Pastor Emmanuel's life had become a shadow of what it once was. The weight of his secrets was too much to carry, and it began to show. Every time he stood in front of his congregation, he felt exposed. He had lost the strong, confident presence that had once made everyone believe in him. His hands would shake as he held the microphone, and his words were no longer as powerful as before. The prayers he used to speak with boldness now seemed forced, as if the fear he felt inside was creeping into every word. As the weeks went by, his mind was consumed by the mounting pressure. The threats from the men he had hired to silence Amaka kept echoing in his ears. The fear of being exposed haunted him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him every day. He knew someone was coming for him. He tried to ignore it, tried to carry on as if everything was fine. But the whispers in the church started to grow louder. The congregation, once full of blind faith, now seemed to question his every move. They noticed his lack of boldness, his hesitation. Some began to talk. Pastor Emmanuel could feel the tension rising, but he didn't know where it was coming from. Inside the church, as he gave his sermons, his mind was far from the words he was saying. His eyes would wander over the crowd, scanning each face. Was there someone in the congregation who knew? Someone who could expose him? The thought sent chills down his spine. He tried to keep his composure, but the fear was almost suffocating. On the other side, Grace and John were working tirelessly, but they knew it wasn't going to be easy. The evidence they had collected was enough to ruin Pastor Emmanuel, but who could they trust? Corruption was everywhere. They knew the judicial system wasn't reliable. There were too many people who could be bought, too many who would turn a blind eye. They couldn't risk handing over the evidence to just anyone. "We have to be careful," Grace said, pacing the small apartment. "We can't just take this to any police officer. Some of them are in his pocket. What if they leak it to him before we can do anything?" John's face was tight with concern. "You're right. We can't trust anyone. But we can't sit on this forever either. He's getting more powerful. We need to act." They both knew they couldn't waste any more time, but their options were limited. They thought about the media, but then the same fear crept in. What if he has connections there too? Grace wondered aloud. We could end up in the same situation. John looked out the window, his mind working fast. What if we find someone outside of the system? Someone who doesn't have the same fear of him? We could go to the press or a journalist who's willing to listen. "I don't know, John," Grace replied. "I just don't want to risk everything and then find out it wasn't enough. We could lose our chance." They sat in silence, both thinking hard. They knew there was no turning back now. They had to take their next step carefully. But while Grace and John were planning their next move, the men who had been hired by Pastor Emmanuel were making their own plans. They were furious that they hadn't been paid the extra money they demanded for Amaka's death. She had not been an easy target. She had fought back. It had taken more effort than they had expected. They felt they deserved more than what Pastor Emmanuel had given them. They had been patient, waiting for the pastor to pay up. But now, they were done waiting. "We've waited long enough," one of the men growled. "The pastor thinks he can ignore us, but we'll make sure he knows we mean business." "I told him we needed more," another man added, his voice full of anger. "He can't just treat us like this. We've done the job, and we want what we're owed. If he thinks we'll just walk away, he's wrong." The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar on his face, slammed his fist on the table. "He gave us the first payment, but he promised more. We're going to make him pay. We've done our part, and now he's going to pay for his mistake." They agreed to give Pastor Emmanuel a 3-day ultimatum. If he didn't pay up, they would make sure he paid in another way. "We won't just let him go," the leader said, his voice cold. "We'll make him regret ever crossing us. He'll learn the hard way." The men left the room, their plan set in motion. They were angry, and they were not going to back down. They were going to make sure Pastor Emmanuel knew exactly what would happen if he didn't keep his word. As all of this unfolded, the tension between Grace, John, and the pastor grew stronger. Both sides were planning, and both sides were running out of time. The stakes were higher than ever, and the closer it got to the deadline, the more dangerous things would become. They were all heading toward the same goal, exposing Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly was. The walls were closing in on him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Pastor Emmanuel's refusal to pay the men only made things worse. The men were furious, and they were not going to let him get away with it. They had been patient, but their patience had run out. They knew Pastor Emmanuel had to be exposed, and they had the perfect way to do it. Using anonymous profiles, they uploaded recordings to social media. The recordings were clear and damning, Pastor Emmanuel's own voice, making deals with the men, agreeing to pay them for doing his dirty work. The recordings showed him telling them how to handle people who might try to expose his secrets, including giving them instructions on how to take out those who were in his way. The posts were shared widely. Bloggers, activists, and social media influencers picked up on it. They shared the videos, calling for justice. The recordings went viral in a matter of hours, and soon, Pastor Emmanuel was the center of a public storm. People began to dig deeper into his past. Old rumors resurfaced. The community, the church, and even the media were all calling for him to explain himself. Pastor Emmanuel's phone rang non-stop. Messages flooded in. Some people, once loyal to him, now questioned his actions. They demanded answers. Social media was flooded with angry posts, hashtags, and calls for Pastor Emmanuel to clear his name. People were speaking out, sharing their own stories, and urging others to join the movement. At first, Pastor Emmanuel tried to deny it. He called the recordings fake, claimed they were taken out of context, and tried to convince his followers that someone was trying to ruin his reputation. But the evidence was too strong. The more he denied it, the more people began to doubt him. He started to lose control. The church, once a place of peace and comfort for him, now felt like a cage. He couldn't even look anyone in the eye. The pressure was too much. The pastors and leaders he had once worked with now turned their backs on him. His reputation was crumbling, and with every new post on social media, it seemed like his world was falling apart. The congregation became divided. Some people still believed in him, clinging to his lies, but many more began to question everything he had told them. The church started to empty out as the truth spread, and Pastor Emmanuel's supporters grew fewer and fewer. On the outside, he remained defiant, still trying to play the role of a man of God. But on the inside, he was breaking. His mind raced with panic. He couldn't go back. He had done too much to cover up, and now it was all coming to light. Soon, the authorities became involved. The leaked recordings were enough to start an investigation, and the pressure on Pastor Emmanuel only grew. It wasn't just about his reputation anymore. It was about his freedom. The truth was finally catching up with him, and there was no way to run from it. People called for justice. They wanted to know the truth about how many lives Pastor Emmanuel had destroyed, how many people had suffered because of him. And there were even whispers that this might be just the beginning. More secrets were waiting to be uncovered. Pastor Emmanuel's world was spiraling out of control. The more he denied it, the more people demanded answers. But the one thing he didn't know yet was that the truth was coming for him, and it was unstoppable. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the city. Grace and John couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the viral posts and videos online. It was happening. Pastor Emmanuel's secret was out, and there was no turning back. For days, Grace and John had been sitting quietly, afraid to act, but now they saw the power of truth unfolding before them. They knew it was time. The world was demanding answers, and they had everything they needed to expose Pastor Emmanuel for the monster he was. John turned to Grace. "This is it. We can't wait any longer." Grace nodded. Her hands trembled, but there was fire in her eyes now. She had lived with the pain of losing Ada for so long, and now it was time to make sure her daughter's death wasn't in vain. She grabbed the folder of evidence they had been holding on to for so long, the photos, the recordings, the testimonies, and held it tight. "We have to go to someone who can get this to the world," Grace said. "Someone who can make sure it's heard by everyone." John agreed. "We'll go to the biggest activist, the one with the power to get this on every screen, every news station." They quickly packed the evidence, made phone calls, and arranged a meeting with one of the most well-known activists in the city, a person who had fought for justice for many others and had a huge following. They knew this was the only way to get the message to the masses. When they met the activist, Grace spoke first. "We have proof of everything Pastor Emmanuel has done, the lives he's ruined, the people he's hurt. We want to make sure he's held accountable." The activist listened carefully, his eyes scanning the evidence. "This is huge," he said after a moment. "This will expose him for everything he is. But we have to make sure we're careful. If we do this right, it will be impossible for him to deny." They handed over all the evidence, and the activist made sure everything was recorded and ready to go. The world would soon know the truth about Pastor Emmanuel and the horror he had caused. As the activist sat in front of the cameras, ready to broadcast the story, Grace and John sat nervously in the background, waiting for the world to hear their daughter's story. The activist began to speak, his voice calm but full of anger at the injustice. "This is the story of a man who used his position of power to manipulate, control, and abuse. Pastor Emmanuel, once seen as a man of God, has used his influence to hurt countless people, including a young girl named Ada. Her parents, Grace and John, are here to share their story and to make sure no one else falls victim to his lies." The camera cut to Grace and John, sitting side by side. Grace's heart was pounding, but she felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, the truth was out. They told their story, how they had trusted Pastor Emmanuel, how they had sent their daughter to him for help, and how he had manipulated her. They spoke about the death of their daughter, about the pain and the guilt they had carried for so long, and they shared the evidence they had gathered. The room went silent as the recordings played. Pastor Emmanuel's voice echoed through the speakers, giving instructions on how to silence those who dared to speak out against him. The video of him making deals with the men he had hired to take out his enemies played next. There was no denying it. The truth was clear for everyone to see. The broadcast went viral instantly. Social media exploded with reactions. People were shocked, disgusted, and outraged. The hashtag #ExposePastor Emmanuel began trending, and soon, more victims came forward, sharing their stories. The media picked up the story, and news outlets around the world covered the scandal. Pastor Emmanuel's world collapsed in front of him. The backlash was unlike anything he had ever faced. His phone was flooded with messages. Some of his loyal followers turned against him, while others defended him. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. Pastor Emmanuel tried to deny everything, but it was too late. The recordings, the testimonies, the evidence, it was all too much. Law enforcement stepped in, and an investigation began. Soon, Pastor Emmanuel was arrested. His power, once untouchable, was gone. As the news spread of his arrest, Grace and John felt a weight lift off their shoulders. Pastor Emmanuel was finally being held accountable for the lives he had destroyed. They had done what they set out to do, not just for Ada, but for every person he had hurt. The fight wasn't over, but it was a victory. The activist who had helped them was hailed as a hero. The world had heard their story, and change was finally starting to happen. Pastor Emmanuel would stand trial for his crimes, and there was no escape for him anymore. In the end, Grace and John knew that justice had been served, and Ada's death had not been in vain. They had fought for her, and now the world would know the truth. The story had come to an end, but it had left behind a legacy, a reminder that no matter how much power someone holds, the truth will always find a way to come to light. And Pastor Emmanuel would face the consequences of his actions. He could no longer hide behind his lies.